by Jenna Markowski and Dave Ormsby from TCRIL, as well as Brayden McDonald from OpenCraft. So I'll leave the stage to you now.
Thanks, Xavier. Awesome. So we're going to talk today about one of the large projects that we've been working on pretty much since the summer, which is likely going to be a multi-year initiative. And that's our Modular Learning Initiative. And so in the summer of last year, about six months ago, TCRIL, OpenCraft, and 2U's been involved as well. We started some discovery work on this initiative. And we started out pretty wide in terms of doing that discovery work. But we eventually landed on this project that will ultimately make the course itself more flexible from an authoring perspective. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, just to kind of set some context. But what this talk is really about is the open process that we took in terms of doing the product research and all of the user stories and the market research bit of it in the open. We took an open first philosophy to it. Our goal was to make this as transparent as possible. And so the things that we'll cover today are how our approach to this discovery process has differed a little bit from past approaches with new feature development. Some of the methods that we used for inclusive product research. I know this question came up today in the state of Open edX, and so this is a good opportunity to do a deep dive into some of the challenges that we ran into and some of the methods that we used to overcome those challenges. We'll talk about how community feedback loops shaped the project. We were very intentional about wanting to create as many points as possible within the project to get iterative feedback from the community. So we'll talk about how we built those and how it shaped the project. We'll talk about some of the challenges that we ran into with the project and some of the learning opportunities as well. And we'll hopefully have a nice open time for Q&A because we'd actually like to learn from some of you as well what we can do in the future to make this a better process. Okay, so I wanted to spend just like 5 minutes to kind of go over the project, just to make sure we're all on the same page about it. Many of you may have heard about it or heard about bits of it. We've been talking about it now for the last all afternoon and this morning, but just to make sure we're all on the same page about what the Modular Learning or Modular Content Initiative is. So there's a couple of benefits to this project, which I'll start off with. So we want to position Open edX to become a platform innovator in modular content delivery. So what this really means is thinking about what can the platform deliver in addition to courses, right? So we've got courses nailed down, right? Like Open edX is a great course delivery platform. What else can we do? So there's been a lot of talk about micro-learning, mini-courses, modular learning, sequential learning, content sequences. So we want to position the platform to be able to do that. Another part of this, another benefit, is that we're really focused on enabling content reuse, which, as we learned in some of the discovery work, is one of the #1 needs of the community. So being able to reuse a unit in one course and in a different course, or a whole section or parts of a course more easily to shorten authoring time and to enable you to leverage your content more broadly. High level fixes some legacy pain points and feature parity gaps. And we want to lay the groundwork for like thinking more long-term about more robust content sharing initiatives. So if we can reuse content, why can't we also like share it between different instances, for example? So this kind of sets us up for that. In terms of the specific objectives of the project, so we're focused on content libraries for the most part. We want to make content libraries like full authoring environments, which I think was the initial goal of libraries to begin with, at least in their V2 block store iteration. So we're focused on building on that project with the work that's already been done. We're also talking about building like dynamic content management systems, because if you're using libraries to create a bunch of components or even units, you need a way to organize that content, to find that content. So how can we also make libraries CMSs effectively? Another objective is to enable the delivery of different types of learning products. So like I was just talking about, there are other things that we could be creating for learners, right? Mini courses, stackable sequences, there's lots of different things that we've heard these things called. So what we're using right now, learning presentations is kind of the catch-all phrase that we've developed to kind of encapsulate this need. And then finally, we want to build easier course and content reuse workflows, not only between Open edX courses, but externally as well. So thinking about how we enhance the LTI frameworks and extension points that exist. And then seamless integration with adaptive engines is the fourth prong of this. So to get us all on the same page, what is modular content, right? Like, so what do we mean when we talk about modularity in the content ecosystem? This is the definition that we landed on. Making all levels of the course hierarchy independent, reusable, and composable as standalone learning products of some sort. So this is the traditional course outline, right? We're all super familiar with the Open edX course structure. We want to make each of these its own independent thing. So sections might be able to stand by themselves, subsections can stand by themselves, units can stand by themselves, and then all the different types of XBlock components can stand by themselves. So currently in the Block Store Libraries project, it's at the component level, and we want to build on that, making units composable and creatable in libraries, reusable, all the way up through subsections and sections. The best way I've heard this described actually is from one of our partners at WGU. We want to bust open the course. I just think that's a better way to frame it. Okay, so that's a bit of an overview of the project. I'll turn it over now to Braden to kind of give a little bit of historic context about how projects have been developed in the past.
So yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how product development in Open edX used to happen, kind of from our perspective at OpenCraft as a solutions provider that was often involved in these projects. And this is sort of before the transition to TCRIL. But typically what would happen is one of our customers would have some type of problem with Open edX that they want to solve. And usually within their organization, they would have some type of product manager or project manager who is thinking about a good solution that will solve the problem for them. So they come up with what they want to see changed in the platform to fix the problem. And then they would come to a provider like OpenCraft and say, hey, we have this problem with Open edX. We want you to build this solution for us. And we try to upstream everything that we do and contribute it back to the platform. So whoever's working on it at OpenCraft would try to think about the community perspective and say, okay, what if we modify your solution slightly to be a bit more generic, and we would come up with a revised solution that we think will solve their problem, but also work really well for the community. And then we would go to someone at edX at the time and find out who the decision maker is, the product owner or maybe an engineering lead, and ask them for their input. And they would help us refine the solution until it's something that will work for edX.org. Often this is a matter of scale and making sure that the solution will work at a huge scale like edX.org uses. And then we would come up with the final plan, taking all those perspectives into account, and we would start development. And then after development is done, before the core contributor program, we often had to wait a long time before someone at edX would review it. And then sometimes the reviewer might be a different person. So sometimes we had this outcome where they would reject the pull request or reject the new feature, and then we would have to maintain it on a fork or start over. So this was not ideal, obviously, but luckily it didn't happen too often. Most of the time, the new feature would be merged into Open edX, and the idea is that then everyone in the community will find this feature useful and start using it. Though in practice, sometimes only the original person that came to us with the problem would be using that feature, and it's there in the platform, but despite the best intentions of everyone along the way, there wasn't a lot of buy-in for the feature, or maybe we didn't have enough energy and budget to publicize the feature widely at the end of this process. So often it would just end up getting used by that single organization. And as I understand, a similar thing would happen within edX. Typically, there would be some problem. An edX product owner would work with university partners to come up with a new feature or solution within the platform. It would get developed. It would get merged into the edX platform. And then sometimes it would be useful to the community and everyone would start using it in the platform. But very often it would be useful for edX.org and they're the only users using it. So that's how it used to happen. And now Jen is going to talk about a new approach.
Okay. the approach that we used was pretty experimental, to be honest, and this is actually a really good opportunity, I think, to refine it further. But what it looked like really in practice is that instead of starting with like one particular problem from one particular user of Open edX, we tried to broaden out that framework and say, what are the problems that everybody's facing? And so the reality is that there are many organizations using the Open edX platform. Many of them have pain points, but when you start to dig into those, a lot of them are very similar. And so what I wanted to do was pull out trends or commonalities across many of the pain points that folks experience. And so we devised kind of a research method, which I'll talk a little bit more about, to put together a group of stakeholders across the community and try and elicit some of the pain points from folks so that we could start to look for commonalities. So we were still talking to people one-on-one about like individual problems or pain points they had. Then we would synthesize those problems into like a generalized problem. So how can we fix this problem kind of platform-wide? Come up with a platform-wide solution that we would then test and iterate back with folks for feedback. Because what we really wanted to be doing is building out solutions across the platform that can work for as many people as possible. But we wanted to make sure to like close that feedback loop, right? To go back to the specific problems and ask, like, does this actually meet, does our general solution meet your specific need? And the idea was to be like, there was like really no like quantitative threshold, but like, does this meet the majority of needs was sort of the parameter that we're using from a central platform perspective. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the specific process of gathering data and how we use that data to then like refine the user stories and refine the specs for the process. So I'll go into some of the details for all of these phases. But the first phase was gathering and synthesizing data from across the community. The second phase was stakeholder interviews, so speaking specifically with folks one-on-one. Oops. 3 was generalized user stories. And then 4th was feedback. Maybe that was actually right, because we tried to build feedback into each step of the process to make it as iterative as possible. And I want to just call out, I know I mentioned this morning in the State of Open edX, but this process really fits into the sort of double diamond delivery method of product discovery as well. So I would say all of this sort of falls into the like discover and define part of that double diamond framework. Okay, so I'll go into some of the details of these phases now. Oops. Okay, so the first phase was all about gathering and synthesizing data from across the community. And this image that I included here, like it's not intended to be read. That was not the point of this. What I really wanted to convey is like how messy this phase was. And intentionally so, right? Like there was no method of standardization. I was going out to folks and asking very widely, like, what are your pain points around course authoring and content creation? And I wanted to make it kind of open-ended to enable people to feel, comfortable and open about sharing what those pain points are from their own perspective. And so I asked everybody, and in a lot of cases I didn't even need to ask. Folks were very happy to just tell me about what these pain points were. I tried to talk to folks in as many contexts as I could. The conference last year was actually like a huge source of information and like pools of knowledge for that as well. And like I said, I wanted to just gather as many pain points as I could that were expressing like challenges and limitations when it comes to the authoring workflow. And then you can see the way this board is organized. Once I did all of that data gathering, I started to look for like trends or commonalities in those data points. And I wanted this to sort of emerge organically. I didn't want this to be prescriptive at all. And as I tried to standardize some of these a little bit, there were sort of like 4 general categories that popped up amongst what everyone was saying. One were problem statements around content reuse. And this is actually what many of the pain points were around. Specific examples, but they all sort of pointed to this problem of I want to be able to like reuse a unit that I create in many courses. Fairly straightforward. A second type or bucket or category that came up was around content sequencing. So wanting to create things that are not courses, right? Being able to sequence content into something else besides a course, some sort of mini course or some sort of learning sequence or something that is smaller than a course. A third category that bubbled up was flexibility in the course structure. So wanting to kind of break apart, this goes back to the bust open the course structure, right? Wanting to be able to experience more of a flexible rather than a prescriptive approach to authoring. And then there was a fourth bucket that was a little bit related but kind of standalone as well around extensibility, like making it much easier to add LTI into your content sequences and that kind of thing. So this is more focused on like the authoring experience rather than the development definition of extensibility. But being able to pull in third-party teaching tools into your courses very easily was sort of the fourth. So that was the first phase. And again, this was still very specific, right? These were all focused on specific questions, specific answers from folks that were about their particular instance. So from there, this is when I started to, so if you imagine that diamond again, right? So we went very, very broad. So now we're at like that broadest tip of product discovery. And so then it was like a process of how do we start to refine again. So the second stage was about moving toward that refinement process. So based on all of that data, I came up with a set of more standardized questions to dig further into like, what do you mean by content reuse? Can we get some consensus on what that means? And I put together a group of stakeholders. There were like 8 to 10 folks from 8 to 10 different organizations. And the goal here was to get representation from across the community as broadly as possible. So I wanted folks from providers. We also interviewed a couple folks with just standalone instances. I wanted diversity as well, so people who have been running an instance for 10 years versus people who were like candidates or were looking at OpenEdX as a candidate to potentially host their courses on. So we put together this group of stakeholders, and I did more formal interviews. And these were standardized questions. So I asked everybody the same thing. I was able to code answers and kind of get a finer level of granularity about what we actually were going to build. And I just put the screenshot up here as an example of what those look like. So one of the questions was like, clarify your needs in regards to content reuse. So we were able to get very particular about like, do you want to reuse units? Do you want to reuse sections? And from there, we were able to distill that units are actually like the most popular thing people want to reuse, but actually like all of it. But we can prioritize from that, right? We can start with units and then we can build from there. And then from there, I was able to refine even further into some generalized user stories. And again, the goal here was to like meet majority needs. Can we create user stories that are common across as many of these pain points as possible? And so just as a couple of examples, as an author, I want to reuse an existing video, problem, unit, or even section from one course to another in order to save time when creating content, for example. This pretty much encapsulated like 8 or 10 of those stickies from the original slide. Or as an author, I want to be able to create units, subsections, and sections independently from the course outline without knowing which course they'll go into. So this is just kind of examples of the generalized user stories that we were able to make out of this. And then the fourth phase was closing that feedback loop, right? Do these general user stories actually meet your specific needs? And from there, we were able to simplify, descope, and prioritize. So I did a second set of interviews with folks, presented them with those user stories. We also had a concept map of what this might actually look like. This was actually our first kind of major feedback loop. We'd actually introduced some like new concepts around creating, as an example, around creating like a new content type, which we were initially calling items. We presented that conceptually to people, and people were like, no, like that's not what we want. We just want to reuse units. And so we actually descoped and simplified based on that feedback. And the project that we have now focuses on like the types of content that we already have baked into the course structure. It's just making them more flexible. And this is an example of one of the concepts, like early, like this is not UX at all, this is more like product, trying to get concepts across. So we'd initially proposed that there would be like a new content type that people would create. And their response was a hearty, like, absolutely not, that's not great. And so then from there, we're using the product management wiki as the place to make all of this public. And so what I just wanted to demonstrate here is after we have the user stories, then we move into like approach specs, how we're thinking about implementing this potentially from a product perspective. What are the specs that we need to build for this? And we landed on the first 2 milestones for this, because this is like a massive initiative, right? So the first 2 milestones that we were also able to prioritize from that feedback were, first of all, reuse was like number 1. So this turned into a copy-paste piece of function now it's in studio, close to being a studio prototype, which is awesome. And then the second milestone are content tagging functions. So if we're going to build libraries, it makes sense to have content tagging in there as well. So all of these are available on the wiki. We made this process open as well, so this was another area for us to kind of experiment with getting feedback from folks. We made the approach memos and all of the tech approaches, which Dave is going to talk about next, open for feedback. Overall, we got over, this is outdated, at this point there's over 100 views of these combined documents, and there were over, at this point, like close to 30 comment threads, which we were really excited about because this is like feedback that we were getting in real time that we could use then to help shape the project. And Dave and Braden will talk more about what some of those specific pieces of feedback were on the technical side. And with that, I will hand it over to Dave.
Yeah, so the technical approach document is the technical counterpart to the product approach memo. It is not a full specification. It's not, it doesn't have a list of all the endpoints and all the apps and so forth. It is a place for us to surface major technical decisions, challenges, big open questions, potential forks in the road, things that need to get answered earlier rather than later, and prioritization. It is also a place where we can put milestones or deliverables, like what stages we want to deliver the technical piece in. But more than that, it started to become a very central place for cross-functional discussion. So, there's activity all over the place. We have forum posts, but with forum posts, we would always point them back to the wiki. Slack threads would get summarized into the wiki document. In-person discussions would get echoed into that document. And then that document will be eventually a hub for all the other things, the pointers out to all the more permanent artifacts. So there will still be architectural decision records. There will still be pull requests. There are any number of Figma discussion threads, but for the really important ones, this document should be the one place that you would be able to discover the day-to-day decisions that are being made. So that is one point. If you have reviewed this document, I would encourage you very strongly to watch it, and just so you get updates, it is something that is being continuously refined and iterated on. Yeah, and so more on that document. It's rough in a lot of places, right? It's come a long way from where it started, but we still have lots of phrases like "this needs to be tested," or well, maybe we could do this. And this is one of those biases I think is tough for a lot of us as engineers, right? We want to actually put together something that we know is fairly solid before we show it to the world and have everyone comment on it. But this whole philosophy of developing on the open means, at least for us, to try to be comfortable with that ambiguity and try to trust that the people that are reviewing this understand that there are a lot of open questions. We will address them, and they are invited to help address those things and give suggestions and feedback to shape it. And that for the goals of transparency and making that feedback cycle as tight as possible, that it's worth it to put that stuff, even though it might be a little more work on the part of reviewers, because you will see things change around more and more. So there was one interesting anecdote which I feel kind of exemplifies what we want, the kind of collaboration we want to see in this. So at one point, Monica Diaz, who is a principal partner support engineer at 2U, hadn't really been working with us prior to that. She reviewed the document and she asked, what if we let people use this to copy paste a custom page? And that was great, and we hadn't thought of it. And particularly, I was there on the engineering side, and I knew because I do OpenX development that custom pages are also X blocks, which is what components are, and so all the technical underpinning is still there. It is very similar, and it would not be a very large lift technically to do this. So I got to chime in on the same thread. Jenna is basically saying, yeah, well, it's the same effort, then we might as well include it in the MVP. And then Ali added it to the designs. And that feedback loop took probably, I think it went from 2 days from start to finish, where we got that suggestion from someone outside the group to finding the engineering feasibility of it, making the product decision, and getting it queued up for UX. Now, one of the challenges that we had in this was the sheer number of communication channels that these things happen on. And there's a wiki, as I mentioned, but some discussions happen on pull requests and GitHub. There are threads that pop up in the modular learning room in Slack. There are Figma threads on for particular mockups. Some things, we talk it through in Google Meet when we have things that we need to hash out. And there are some threads in discourse, most of which just point to the wiki. But our main way we tried to mitigate this was, again, to try to make sure that everything made it back into the wiki, into those two documents. And it does involve a certain amount of work, a certain amount of duplication to try to keep that in sync. The other is just information overload, not just that there are many channels that you might want to keep. Again, subscribe to watch those 2 wiki pages, and you should be able to get at least the highlights. But even if you're just getting that, it's very bursty, right? So what might happen, for instance, is Ali might go and deliver mockups one day that highlights a couple of different possible workflows for something, and all of a sudden, after a week of relative quiet, you get this flurry of threads. Some of them on the wiki, some of them in Figma, some of them on Slack, where you have 4 or 5 of us just pounding away for hours and having these long threads. So it is kind of it can be a kind of challenging situation for people to come into it more casually. Now again, part of this is synthesizing it into the docs, the wiki doc, but also in some places we explicitly try to slow down the decision-making cycle to give people that opportunity to come in and take a look. So some things were explicitly okay, this is the information, we'll wait a week to see if anybody else has any input on this or objections to this, and then if that is, if we hear nothing else, then this is the thing that's going forward. And the other challenge is, people, how to get involved with this might not be entirely clear. And actually, this is something that that I'm curious to take a little straw poll here, because we're trying very hard to be as public, as transparent, and as inclusive as possible on this project, right? And we try to advertise it in a bunch of places. We put it in forums, we put it, we've talked about it in various places. It's in Slack, on a number of channels. But just a show of hands, say the studio copy-paste feature. How many people heard about it before they came to the conference today? Okay. No, you commented on the thread. I posted it in November. So I posted that thread the day after we decided to do it, and you're on the thread. So I know you saw that one. But who? So can I get a set of hands of who wanted to get involved or would have wanted to get involved with this, but didn't feel that they could, either because not because you were busy, but either because it wasn't accessible to you, or it wasn't clear how to get involved, or anything like that. Were there people who encountered barriers to getting involved with this? Anyone? Okay, all right. Yeah, so you know, I think that is the thing that we'll continue to come back to. Like we won't. Oh yes, okay. And now I will hand it over to Braden.
So OpenEdX is an open source project, obviously, and I wanted to ask, can we learn from other open source projects about how they do product development and set their roadmap and develop features out in the open? So the first thing that came to mind was Python, the programming language that OpenEdX is mostly built with. It's not exactly a product process, but they have the well-known Python enhancement proposal process, and they have this workflow that you go through when you want to come up with a change to Python. And you start by posting an idea on the forum, and then if it gets a good reception, if it's a small change, you open an issue in their bug tracker, and if it's a big change, you open a Python enhancement proposal. And then it goes through this formal process of discussion by the community and revision, and eventually will be either accepted or rejected. And this process was a direct inspiration for the OpenEdX enhancement proposal process, which we now have for making major architectural or community decisions for OpenEdX. And the process is kind of similar. You write a proposal, and then it gets reviewed by the community, and eventually a decision is made. But the thing about these is they're pretty technical, and they're not really what we usually associate with product decisions. So I think from this list, arguably only OEP 57, the core product offering OEP, is really what we think about product type of decisions. So I asked, are there other open source projects that are more user-facing that we can learn from? So these are 3. Each of these is an open source project supported by a foundation, and you probably have one or more of these apps on your phone or your computer. I wanted to see what they do for a product in the open. Signal, the messaging app, it doesn't have a public roadmap, so you just learn about features after they're developed and announced on the blog. VLC, the video player, they have a GitLab page where you can track all the issues in the next milestone that is coming up and discuss them. But it's incredibly noisy. There's more than 1,000 issues on there. And so I think as a user, it's not really useful to get a sense of what's coming or to engage with. And Firefox used to have a public roadmap, then did not for a long time. They announced this year that they would be doing a new one, but it's been several months and there's no sign of it yet. But when I read online, users were very excited about the potential for the roadmap coming back and hoping to see it soon. So eventually I discovered Blender, which is also an open source project supported by a foundation, and it's used by artists to create 3D assets for games or to create movies entirely in 3D, that sort of thing. And so they have this super nice blog. Here's a post about what's coming this year in Blender. You can get a sense of what's on the roadmap. But they also have weekly updates and very regular blog posts about what's going on in the Blender community. And then, like OpenEdX, they divide into what they call modules, but you might think of it as our working groups, where they organize around particular topics, and there's a person in charge of each one who works at the foundation. And then they have their own discussion posts and resources for each of these modules to coordinate development. And then they have chat. You can chat with developers and managers. You can watch the YouTube channel where you can watch people working on Blender. You can go on Twitter and follow their announcements. They have a Blender Today video series. They have weekly meetings. They have module-specific meetings. And then on the forum, you can see there's very active posts for the community requesting input and having discussions about what the product is doing and where it's going. So I was very excited to see that, and I think Blender does a really good job of engaging with the community in their product development, and we can kind of take some inspiration from what they're doing. Let me see. So, based on my little research, I came up with this theory of open source product development. And that is, if you have a changelog, that's good, that's a good starting point. If you have a roadmap, now you're really getting my attention. Not so many people have a roadmap. It's pretty difficult to do. But if you really have product planning in the open, wow. Well, I think we're kind of breaking new ground here. So that's what I'm very excited to be doing. And if any of you know of other open source projects that we can learn from, I'd love to hear about it in the question period, or just let us know afterwards. In fact, I think that's the end of our prepared slides, and we can take questions now.
Don't be shy. Have you looked into GitLab for their process? Because they have a lot of designers, and I think most of it is in public too.
That's true. I didn't think of that one, to be honest. But thanks.
Wait.
Hi. So Dave, you mentioned that there was points where you wanted to slow the process down. And there's a obvious tension between going fast and delivering quickly and getting the value out there versus getting as much feedback as possible from all the stakeholders. I'm just curious as to general thoughts on how to manage that tension, because sitting where I am, my current job, going fast is key.
Yeah,
right? Going as fast as possible, delivering value as fast as possible, because I'm, delivering to the community. I'd love, everything we do will be open sourced, will be available, it's going to be public.
Right.
But we need to deliver value fast as possible, and I'm just kind of curious about managing that tension.
I mean, I think there are a couple of things at play. I think one is partly to mitigate that is, so I mentioned in the internal document, we have like a list of questions, and a lot of those questions are not necessarily blocking work now. We know they will block work at some point, like in the not too distant future. So some of those questions can be queued up as issues that, when things are brought up, there's a question of like, do we have to decide that right now, or is this something that can wait, or is this something that we can throw out there and cycle for a little bit? But I think at the end of the day, yes, you could. It is going to slow things down in terms of like the delivery speed on it. Like that conversation that Monica started and that we had about adding that one particular feature to the MVP. That's something that if we were sitting in the room, we could have decided together in maybe certainly in a single meeting, half-hour meet together and decide, okay, yes, let's do it. But at the same time, Monica wouldn't have been in that room to begin with. And I think that the fact that anyone could have made that comment out there, and we would have, and they would have gotten the same response. I think, and it's a better product because of it, right? Like if we hadn't had that step, we wouldn't have gotten that feedback. So yeah, I think it's kind of a trade-off. Like we can deliver faster in certain things, but I think for things that are sort of long-term, especially things that are sort of low-level foundational that we want to build other pieces on top of, it is worth it to slow that down a little bit to get more feedback. And I think Jenna probably has many more thoughts on it.
Yeah.
Oh, where are you?
Oh, I'm still mic'd. I forgot I'm mic'd. I think it's also the type of project as well should dictate the timeline. So this is a TCRL-funded project, right? We're trying to develop it across different organizations with OpenCraft, with TCRL, 2U's been involved as well. And so in some ways we kind of have the luxury of time in that regard, in that we're driving it. And like Dave noted, it's a foundational project that we're gonna build off of. And so thinking long-term, it makes sense, I think, to take a little bit more time at the outset to ensure that we've got consensus. But for projects that are contributions from the community, we could work on different timelines as well in terms of those feedback loops, right? Instead of keeping something open for 3 weeks, we could shorten it, right, and have it open for a couple days. And I think that's something that we should probably think about at TCRL is as we're setting up infrastructure to review projects, being flexible about timelines based on who's contributing, what timeline are they contributing it on, do we need to have like a process for turning feedback around, based on the needs of an external client or something. So I think it's like project dependent as well, and we certainly don't want this community feedback process to become a barrier to people contributing stuff or contributing early, because we don't want to hold you up either.
Also, not every organization can do this, but usually, you think of this as we plan it internally, and then later we ask for community feedback. If you can kind of open the door on what you're doing as you're developing the initial plan, you can make those overlap a little bit, and it can save you some time. It depends on what you're doing, how much you can do that, but if that's a possibility too, then sort of develop it in the public, because even within your organization, you don't just rush into developing something without coming up with a plan and doing some market research or whatever it is that you need to do. If you can make any of that public, then it shortens the community review that comes after.
Thank you. What would be your thoughts into how to handle the expectations when the original problem was proposed by a client, for example, and they funded part of the project, but then it diverts significantly? Like the end result going through the community process diverts significantly from the initial proposed solution that you mentioned in the previous model.
Yeah, it's a good question. We're running into this a little bit with some of the PR processes. I don't know if anyone was in the PR talk earlier today. But one of the things, like tangible examples of that we've run into with PRs that have been submitted that are then reviewed by product, is that there's a concern about the scope of the initial project, in that it was only scoped for a certain part of the platform, and really if we're thinking platform-wide, it should be sort of expanded in scope. And so we're kind of working through a process of, is there a way, again, with the TCRL as sort of the center of the kind of ecosystem in this regard as a steward, is there a way that we can create a pathway for those projects that have that scope creep from the original perspective into the backlog, and then we can look at maybe having a funding pool for implementing like the bigger project that emerged from the rescoping exercises. So it's something we're kind of like actively thinking about. In terms of like this feedback process, I mean, we didn't really like this. The nature of the project changed early on, which was kind of anticipated, right? Like we were putting big new ideas out there because we had the luxury of being able to put big new ideas out there, and we ended up kind of de-scoping a little bit. But once it got to the point where it was like, here's the approach, here's like the technical proposal, it didn't really change drastically, right? It was like little things here and there. So this project is probably not the best example of that, but yeah, we'd have to think about like, do we then break the project into phases, for example? Are there ways that like TCRL could fund further implementations potentially? There's ways we could think through it.
I can speak briefly to that too. Like, as I showed you the sort of process we used earlier for product planning and stuff, often it's what you're asking right now. Through those later phases of engagement and trying to bring into account the community perspective, does that prevent the original customer, in this case, from getting what they wanted? And usually the answer is no, that's not usually a problem. Almost always you end up with a better approach when you engage more people and try to make something more generic and more flexible, and you get more input. So just in practice, it doesn't happen super often. What does tend to be the problem, I think, is when you get a lot of input and you come up with a more generic, flexible solution, it's often more complex to build, and that means more expensive, and then maybe you don't have the budget to build it anymore. And that's something that's very exciting about TCRL now, is they can help coordinate projects across the community and say, these guys want this thing, but we really should do this bigger thing. Can other people contribute? And we had kind of tried to get that going in the past with pretty limited success, and I'm really excited to see that it's happening now with TCRL kind of playing that role to help get those bigger projects moving.
Though I will note that there was a substantial amount of scope cutting in this particular project. And so it is not a light, just because TCRL is funding something does not mean that there will not be scope cutting.
We cut ourselves.
Yes, we cut ourselves, yes, because, for delivery reasons.
It will be the last question.
So like someone else did, I have two questions, but the first one's real quick. De-scoping means cutting scope?
Yeah.
Okay, just wanted to make sure I understood that. The other question's a little harder. How did you interact with, how do you want to interact with large organizations that might have multiple viewpoints? Do you want to hear from all of us?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Yes, is the answer. Yeah.
It's not another question, but just to say, that has not always been our practice. There are some reasons for that, and we might want to think about that, but it's good to know what your intentions are.
I may have regretted what I just said. I guess part of to sort of respond to that a little bit, part of the challenge that we have is knowing who to talk to. So for some of these bigger organizations, it's kind of like, I'll talk to whoever will talk to me, quite frankly, and I'm not often sure who to ask, and so I will ask anybody and everybody, and that's kind of the approach that I think most product people will take in that early discovery phase. Yeah, my flat answer is always yes for that, but it's often, if I am not inclusive, it's just because I don't know that I should have talked to somebody. I didn't know that department or that organization or whatever exists. So.
All right, thank you very much, and congratulations.